My ex forced me to marry his fiancée's brother, so I made them homeless on their honeymoon.
My name is Elena, and today, I'm not just a bride, I'm a transaction. The man I'm about to marry is Leo, a man I've barely spoken to. But the man pulling the strings from the shadows? That's Julian, my ex-boyfriend, my first love, and the man who currently holds my father's life and my family's legacy in his manicured hands. How did I get here? 6 months ago, I was the head of acquisitions for my family's tech firm. I was independent, sharp, and deeply in love with Julian. Or so I thought. I didn't know that Julian had been playing a long game. He didn't just want my heart, he wanted the patent my father had spent 30 years developing. When I refused to hand over the encryption keys, Julian didn't just leave me, he dismantled me. He framed my father for embezzlement, froze our assets, and then, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, offered me a solution. He would drop the charges and clear the debt, provided I married Leo, the deadbeat, alcoholic brother of his new fiancée, Isabella. Julian's logic was sadistic. By marrying me off to Isabella's brother, he ensured I was legally bound to her family, effectively silencing me and keeping me under his thumb. He wanted to watch me wither away while he lived high on the hog in the penthouse my father built. But as I adjusted my veil, looking at the hollowed-out version of myself in the mirror, I realized Julian had made one fatal mistake. He thought he had taken everything from me. He forgot that a woman who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the room. The ceremony was a blur of flashing cameras and forced smiles. Julian stood at the front as the best man, a cruel irony that wasn't lost on anyone. He looked at me with a smirk that said, "I own you." Beside him was Isabella, draped in diamonds that were likely bought with my family's stolen dividends. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and triumph. To her, I was just the charity case her brother was taking off the streets to satisfy Julian's whims. Leo, my groom, smelled faintly of gin and looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. He wasn't a monster, just a broken tool being used by people much more ambitious than him. When the priest asked if I took Leo to be my husband, the silence in the cathedral stretched for an eternity. I could feel Julian's eyes burning into me, a silent reminder of the prison cell waiting for my father if I said no. I looked at Julian, gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, and whispered, "I do." The trap was set. But what Julian didn't know was that the debt he thought he was using to leverage me was actually a paper trail I had been meticulously rerouting for weeks. As we walked down the aisle as husband and wife, the applause sounded like crashing waves. Julian leaned in as we passed him, whispering, "Enjoy the honeymoon, Elena. It's a gift from the family." He didn't mean a vacation, he meant the start of my life as a social pariah. He and Isabella were headed to a private island in the Maldives for their honeymoon the next day, a trip funded by the very company he had stolen from me. They thought they were heading to paradise. They didn't realize they were walking into a financial minefield I had spent every sleepless night since our breakup preparing. That evening, at the reception, the educational part of Julian's downfall began. You see, Julian is a master of appearance wealth. He moves money around to look rich, but he doesn't understand the foundations of equity. He thought he had seized my family's holdings, but he had only seized the management rights. The actual ownership? That was buried in a series of shell companies and trust funds tied to a marriage clause my grandfather had written 40 years ago. By forcing me to marry Leo, a blood relative of Isabella, Julian had inadvertently triggered a cross-collateralization clause he didn't even know existed. I sat at the head table, watching Julian and Isabella toast to their bright future. They were laughing about the yacht they had just bought, the one currently docked in the harbor, waiting to take them on their honeymoon. They felt invincible. They felt like they had won the war because they had won the first battle. I took a sip of water, my eyes meeting Leo's. He looked at me, confused by the sudden cold calm in my expression. "You're not crying anymore," Leo muttered, his voice raspy. "No, Leo," I replied, my voice as sharp as a razor. The time for crying ended the moment I signed that marriage license. Now, It's time for accounting. As the clock struck midnight, marking the official start of Julian and Isabella's honeymoon departure, I pulled a small, encrypted burner phone from my garter. I sent a single text message to a contact listed only as the auditor. The message read, "The bridge is crossed. Burn it." Within seconds, the legal machinery I had set in motion began to grind. In the world of high finance, it doesn't take much to collapse a house of cards. You just have to pull the right card at the right time. Julian had used my father's debt to force this marriage. But by marrying Leo, I had technically become a legal partner in Isabella's family estate. And because Julian had merged his assets with Isabella's in preparation for their own wedding, he had just walked into a legal commingling of funds that gave me, as Leo's wife, the power to freeze every single account associated with their names. I watched from the balcony of the ballroom as Julian and Isabella stepped into their limousine, headed for the airport. They were blowing kisses to the crowd, the king and queen of a kingdom that, unbeknownst to them, had just been repossessed. They were heading to a private jet that wouldn't take off, to a yacht that was currently being boarded by marshals, and to a luxury villa in the Maldives that had just had its reservation cancelled due to insufficient funds. The secret? I wasn't just a victim. I was the architect of their ruin. Julian thought he was forcing me into a marriage that would destroy me. Instead, he had handed me the keys to his own destruction. As their limo pulled away, I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was my father's lawyer, holding a briefcase. "It's done, Elena," he whispered. "By the time they land for their layover, they won't even have enough credit left to buy a bottle of water. They're effectively homeless." I looked out at the city lights, the heavy lace of the wedding dress no longer feeling like a shroud, but like armor. The game was just beginning, and Julian was about to find out exactly what happens when you underestimate the woman you try to break. There is a specific kind of silence that happens when a person who has never heard the word no suddenly loses everything. It's not a loud silence, it's a deafening, pressurized void. As Julian and Isabella stepped out of their black car at the private aviation terminal, the world was still their oyster. They were laughing, Isabella's head tilted back as she scrolled through the likes on her wedding posts, while Julian checked his Rolex with the smug satisfaction of a man who had just successfully executed a hostile takeover of a human life. They thought they were about to board a Gulfstream G650 for the Maldives. They didn't realize they were actually walking toward a cliff. The first sign of the collapse was the pilot. Captain Miller, a man who had been on Julian's payroll for 3 years, wasn't standing by the stairs with a warm towel and a flute of champagne. He was standing near the hangar, arms crossed, looking at a tablet with a grim expression. When Julian snapped his fingers and told him to get the luggage on board, Miller didn't move. He didn't even apologize. He simply said, "The flight plan has been cancelled, Mr. Sterling. The fuel company hasn't been paid, and the tail number has been flagged by a court-ordered injunction." Julian laughed. It was that sharp, condescending bark he used when he thought someone was being incompetent. He pulled out his Centurion Black card, the card that is supposed to be able to buy a tank or a small island, and shoved it toward the pilot. "Run it again," Julian commanded. "There's 5 million in liquid credit on that card alone. Whatever the glitch is, fix it." But as the ground agent swiped the card inside the terminal, the screen didn't show the usual authorization code. Instead, it flashed a cold, clinical red, account restricted, refer to issuing legal authority. This is where the educational part of the nightmare began for Julian. You see, most people think that when you freeze an account, the money just sits there. But I had used a prejudgment writ of attachment. Because Julian had used my family's tech company assets as collateral for his personal loans to marry Isabella, and because I was now legally tied to Isabella's family through Leo, I had filed an emergency claim of asset dissipation. In simpler terms, I told the courts Julian was trying to flee the country with stolen funds. In the eyes of the law, every penny he touched was now evidence, not currency. Isabella's face began to transform. The pampered, porcelain mask of a socialite started to crack. "Julian, what is happening?" she hissed, her voice rising in pitch. "The Maldives. We have the sunset dinner at the underwater restaurant. I already posted the countdown." She tried to use her own card to pay for the fuel, a card backed by her family's trust. Declined. She tried her secondary visa. Declined. She tried to log into her banking app, only to find the message, "Access denied. Please contact your legal representative." While they were melting down on the tarmac, I was sitting in the back of a modest Uber, miles away from the wedding venue. Leo was beside me, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. He looked like a man who had just been handed a life sentence, unaware that I had actually just handed him a key to a freedom he never thought he'd have. I watched the notifications on my phone, the silent pings from the auditor. Julian had tried to call his CFO. The CFO didn't pick up because the CFO had been served with a subpoena 20 minutes ago. Julian tried to call his lawyer. The lawyer's firm had just been informed that their retainer was being contested as fraudulent transfer. The true beauty of the plan wasn't just the money. It was the displacement. Julian and Isabella had sold their respective apartments 3 weeks prior, intending to move into my father's sprawling estate, the Sterling Vane Manor, the moment they returned from their honeymoon. They had already sent their personal belongings to a high-end storage facility. But guess what? The storage facility's contract was tied to the same frozen corporate account. By 2 a.m., they weren't just broke, they were literally locked out of their lives. They had the clothes on their backs, tuxedos and silk dresses, and no place to go. Elena. Leo finally spoke. His voice was small. Why did you do it? I know you hate Julian. But why marry me? You could have just run away. I looked at Leo, and for a second, I felt a flicker of pity. If I had run, Julian would have hunted me down using the law. But by marrying you, Leo, I became the law in this family. I didn't marry you to be your wife. I married you to be your guardian. I didn't tell him the rest yet, that his own sister, Isabella, had been the one to suggest Julian dispose of me by forcing this marriage. Leo was a victim of his own family's greed, and while I was using him, I was also the only person who was ever going to give him a fair shake. Back at the airport, the situation had turned ugly. The private terminal staff, who are trained to be the height of discretion, were now asking Julian and Isabella to leave the premises. They were loitering. Isabella was screaming at a 22-year-old gate agent, her $100,000 engagement ring glinting uselessly in the fluorescent light. Julian was on his 4th phone call, his face a shade of purple I had never seen before. He finally reached someone who told him the truth. "It's Elena," the voice on the other end must have said. Because Julian suddenly stopped screaming. He went deathly quiet. He looked at the phone as if it were a poisonous snake. He realized that the quiet, broken girl he had bullied into an altar was the one who had just pulled the plug on his entire universe. He realized that every luxury he had planned for his honeymoon, the yacht, the villa, the private chef, wasn't just gone. It was mine. Where are we going to sleep? Isabella wailed, her heels clicking frantically on the linoleum. Julian. Do something. Call a hotel. With what, Isabella? Julian whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. We have no credit. We have no cash. We don't even have a car. The limo driver left when he realized the company account was flagged. They stood there, in the middle of a deserted private terminal at 3 a.m, dressed in the finest clothes money could buy, and they were utterly, completely homeless. The homelessness I had promised wasn't just about a roof. It was about the total removal of their social safety net. They had spent years burning bridges, thinking they were flying too high to ever need them again. Now, gravity was catching up. I turned my phone off and leaned my head against the cool glass of the Uber window. The first phase was complete. They were grounded. They were broke. And they were desperate. But the twist Julian hadn't figured out yet was even more delicious. He thought this was about revenge for my father. He didn't realize that I hadn't just frozen his money. I had already started spending it. There is a specific kind of humiliation that comes with wearing a $12,000 hand-tailored tuxedo while sitting on a plastic bench at a city bus stop. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in mocking shades of gold and pink, Julian and Isabella were no longer the golden couple of the social registry. They were two people who looked like they were stumbling home from a costume party that had gone horribly wrong. Isabella's mascara had moved from her lashes to her cheeks, creating dark, jagged rivers through her foundation. Her silk gown, designed for the pristine decks of a yacht, was now stained with the grime of a terminal floor. They had spent 3 hours trying to call friends, the kind of people who kiss your cheek at galas, only to find that news travels faster than a private jet. In our circle, status is a currency, and word had already leaked. The Sterling Vane Empire was under a legal cloud. In the world of the ultra-rich, a legal cloud is more contagious than the plague. No one picked up the phone. "We can't stay here, Julian," Isabella whimpered, her voice cracking as a commuter bus hissed to a stop in front of them, smelling of diesel and old coffee. "Look at these people. They're staring." Julian didn't answer. He was staring at his reflection in the bus stop glass, seeing a man he didn't recognize. He had built his entire identity on the foundation of my father's hard work, and without the credit cards and the titles, he was just a man in a fancy suit with no place to go. He finally did what he thought he'd never have to do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill he'd taken from a tip jar at the airport bar in a moment of pure, panic survival. It was the only cash they had. They didn't take a limo. They didn't take an Uber Black. They took a predatory, dented yellow taxi to a motel on the outskirts of the city. A place where the sign flickered with a buzzing vacancy and the carpet smelled of decades of secrets and cheap bleach. The honeymoon suite Julian had promised Isabella was a room with a bolted-down television and a bedspread that felt like sandpaper. As Isabella collapsed onto the bed, sobbing into a pillow that probably hadn't been deep cleaned since the 90s, Julian stood by the window, watching the neon sign blink on and off. He was waiting for his ego to tell him this was a dream. But the itch of the cheap polyester sheets was very, very real. While they were discovering the joys of budget lodging, I was standing in the center of the Sterling Vane penthouse, the very apartment Julian had planned to move into this morning. I wasn't there as a guest. I was there as the new majority shareholder. You see, the educational lesson Julian missed in his haste to ruin me was the bad boy clause embedded in the corporate bylaws of my father's firm. In high-level corporate law, many contracts have a morality or bad boy provision. If an executive is found to be engaging in fraudulent conversion or tortious interference against the company's interests, their voting shares can be temporarily suspended. By filing the evidence of Julian's embezzlement and his attempt to coerce me into marriage to cover his tracks, I didn't just freeze his money, I triggered a corporate coup. I walked through the rooms, looking at the minimalist furniture Julian had picked out. He liked things cold and sharp. I preferred warmth and history. I signaled to the movers I had hired, men who were currently packing Julian's expensive art and Italian leather chairs into boxes marked storage, pending legal clearance. By the time Julian found a way to get back to this building, his key fobs wouldn't work, his name would be stripped from the directory, and the locks would be changed to biometric scanners that only recognized my thumbprint. Elena! Leo's voice echoed through the marble hallway. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city he had been a ghost in for so long. You really meant it, didn't you? You didn't just want to stop them. You wanted to replace them. Replacement is a temporary goal, Leo, I said, joining him at the window. I want restoration. This isn't just about taking back what's mine. It's about showing them what it feels like to be the collateral damage in someone else's game. I handed Leo a folder. Inside was a deed to a small, quiet house in the countryside, along with a modest but stable trust fund in his name only. That's yours. As soon as the annulment is finalized in 6 months, you're free. No more debts. No more Isabella using you as a pawn. But for the next few weeks, I need you to stay married to me. I need the legal standing of being part of your family to finish the audit. Leo looked at the deed, then back at me. For the first time, I saw a spark of something other than defeat in his eyes. You're the most terrifying person I've ever met, he whispered. And the only person who's ever been honest with me. The suspense, however, was just beginning. Because while I had the money and the penthouse, Julian still had the one thing I couldn't legally touch yet, the founder's key. It was a physical hardware drive that held the master code for my father's encryption patent. Julian had hidden it somewhere before the wedding. He thought that as long as he had the key, I would eventually have to negotiate. He thought he could trade the key for his life back. My phone buzzed. It was a restricted number. I knew it was him. I answered, but I didn't say a word. I know you can hear me, Elena. Julian's voice came through, no longer smug, but trembling with a jagged, dangerous edge. You think you've won because we're in a shithole motel and my cards don't work? You've just made the stakes higher. I have the key. Without it, your father's company is just a shell. It's worth 0. If I don't get my accounts unfrozen by noon tomorrow, I'm not just going to hide the key, I'm going to destroy it. And then we both lose everything. How does it feel, Elena? Knowing you're the queen of a kingdom that's about to turn into dust. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. Julian, I said calmly, you've always been a fan of the scorched earth policy. But you forgot one thing about my father's design. What? He spat. The key isn't the only way in. It was a test of character. My father knew that one day, someone like you might try to steal it. So he built a shadow protocol. It only activates when the key is missing for more than 24 hours while the company is under a legal injunction. Do you know what the shadow protocol does, Julian? It doesn't just lock the patent. It broadcasts the entire source code to every one of our competitors for free. It turns your billion-dollar asset into a public utility. The silence on the other end was absolute. Julian realized that his last piece of leverage wasn't a shield, it was a suicide vest. And I was the one with my hand on the timer. "You're lying," he choked out. "You'd never destroy the family legacy just to hurt me." "I'm not destroying it, Julian. I'm making it so that no one can ever own it again. If I can't have it, and you can't have it, then the world gets it. And you get to watch from your motel room as the greatest treasure you ever stole becomes worthless. Sleep tight, Julian. I hear the continental breakfast at that motel is subpar." I hung up. But as I turned to Leo, the weight of the lie hit me. There was no shadow protocol. I was bluffing with a hand that had nothing but a pair of twos. If Julian destroyed that key, my father's life work really would be gone. I had 24 hours to find where he'd hidden it before he realized I was playing the biggest bluff in history. There is a profound clarity that comes at 6 a.m. when you are lying on a lumpy mattress in a roadside motel, listening to your husband of less than 24 hours pace the stained carpet like a caged animal. For Isabella, that clarity was terrifying. The previous night's adrenaline, the shock, the screaming, the denial, had faded, leaving behind a cold, hard reality that smelled faintly of mildew and cheap air freshener. She watched Julian. The man she thought was her ticket to the ultimate socialite throne was currently trying to shave with a disposable razor and hand soap, muttering curses under his breath. He looked frantic, sweaty, and small. The golden aura of power he usually projected was gone, replaced by the desperate energy of a con artist whose marks had finally woken up. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my father's study at the penthouse, surrounded by a silence that felt heavy. The bluff about the shadow protocol had bought me time, but it was a terrifyingly small amount. I had 24 hours before Julian called my hand. If he destroyed that key, everything I had fought for, my father's legacy, the company's future, my own redemption, would vaporize. I was playing chess with a man who was willing to flip the board, and I had just told him I had a bomb under the table when all I really had was a stopwatch. I needed to find that key. And I knew there was only one person desperate enough to tell me where it was. Back in motel room 109, the alliance was fracturing. Julian was obsessed with the shadow protocol. He was furiously scribbling on motel stationery, trying to recall every technical conversation he'd ever overheard my father have, trying to figure out if the protocol was theoretically possible. He was ignoring Isabella completely. When she asked if they could at least go buy toothpaste with the few dollars they had left, he snapped. "Shut up, Isabella. Do you not understand? If that protocol is real, we are not just broke, we are finished. I am trying to save our lives, and you're worried about dental hygiene." That was the moment. The look in Isabella's eyes shifted from fear to calculation. She was a creature of comfort, yes, but she was also a survivor in the viper pit of high society. She realized right then that Julian wasn't trying to save them. He was trying to save himself. She was just baggage now. A trophy wife without a pedestal. She looked at her reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. She was still Isabella Vane. She still had her name, even if her assets were frozen. And she realized that in this new world order I had created, information was a more valuable currency than diamonds. I knew Isabella would break. It was just a matter of applying the right pressure. I didn't call her. I knew Julian would be monitoring her phone if it even still had service. Instead, I used Leo. At 8 a.m., a courier arrived at the dingy motel office addressed to Mrs. Isabella Sterling. It contained a single, high-end cosmetic bag, a small reminder of the luxury she was missing. Inside the bag wasn't makeup. It was a burner phone with one number programmed into it, and a note in Leo's handwriting. "Elena is offering a lifeboat. Only one seat available." Isabella waited until Julian went outside to try and get a better signal for another frantic, useless phone call to his lawyers. She locked the bathroom door, turned on the shower to create white noise, and dialed the number. I answered on the first ring. "Hello, Isabella. How's the honeymoon suite?" "Cut the crap, Elena." Her voice was shaky, but hard. "I know what this is. You want something. What is it, and what do I get?" "Direct and transactional. I always appreciated that about you," I said, leaning back in my father's leather chair. "I have a one-time offer. I am willing to unfreeze a small, personal trust fund in your name only. Enough to get you out of that motel, into a decent apartment, and keep you in Manolo Blahnik's for a year while you figure out your next move. You get to walk away. You divorce Julian, you claim you were a victim of his schemes, and you rebuild." I heard her intake of breath. It was the sound of a drowning woman being thrown a rope. And what do you want for that, Elena? You don't give anything away for free. I want to know where Julian went yesterday morning, right before the ceremony. There was a 2-hour window where he went off-grid. He ditched his security detail. Where did he go? Silence stretched on the line. Isabella knew exactly what I was asking for. She knew that by telling me, she was hammering the final nail into Julian's coffin. She was betraying her husband on day one of their marriage. But then, she looked around the grimy bathroom, thought about Julian's screaming fit, and realized that loyalty was a luxury she could no longer afford. He went to the Freeport, she whispered. My blood ran cold. The Freeport. It wasn't a bank. It was a max security, tax-free storage facility located in a diplomatic gray zone near the shipping docks. It was where billionaires stored priceless art, blood diamonds, and things they didn't want any government to know existed. It was a fortress. Which vault, Isabella? I pressed. He didn't use a vault, she said, her voice gaining strength as she committed to the betrayal. He's too paranoid for that. He said vaults have records. He rented a transit container. It's meant for temporary storage of high-value cargo moving between countries. He put something in there. He said it was his insurance policy in case your father ever tried to double-cross him from prison. A transit container at the Freeport. It was brilliant and terrifying. It was outside regular jurisdiction, guarded by private military contractors, and notoriously impossible to get a warrant for. Julian had hidden the key in the hardest place on earth to break into. The container number, Isabella, I demanded. I don't know the number. He wouldn't tell me. But he has the access fob. He wears it around his neck, under his shirt. He hasn't taken it off since yesterday morning. Thank you, Isabella. Your trust fund will be active in 1 hour. Enjoy your freedom. I hung up before she could say anything else. I stared at the phone. I knew where the key was. It was around the neck of a desperate, furious man holed up in a motel room, guarded by his own paranoia. And to get it, I would have to do something I never thought I'd be capable of. I couldn't use lawyers. I couldn't use the police. I had to go into that motel room and take it from him. The educational portion of the evening was over. Now, it was time for a heist.